People think the biggest mistake a developer can make is building in the wrong place, but that isn't true. The biggest mistake is building on land that already belongs to someone else. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the cabins. It was the smoke rising through the pine trees where no smoke had any business being. I had walked those same trails across my family's timberland for more than 40 years, and every ridge, every creek, every stand of white pine felt as familiar as the rooms inside my own home. That was why the thin gray columns drifting above the forest immediately caught my attention. Someone was living out there. As I climbed the old logging road with my truck bouncing over gravel my grandfather had laid decades ago, the scent of fresh-cut lumber mixed with wood smoke until I reached the overlook above the eastern valley. I stopped so suddenly that my coffee spilled across the console. Sitting below me, tucked neatly among towering pines, stood 52 finished cabins with fresh cedar siding, stone chimneys, winding walking paths, decorative lanterns, and a reception lodge flying the banner of Blackwood Ridge HOA. Families wandered between the cabins carrying backpacks and fishing poles. Children laughed near a fire pit. A maintenance cart rolled along freshly paved lanes that hadn't existed the last time I surveyed this property 6 months earlier. For a long moment, I simply stared. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody acted like they were trespassing. They looked completely convinced they belonged there. That was the part that bothered me most. Someone had invested millions of dollars into a resort hidden inside my timberland, and every single person below believed it was perfectly legal. I didn't drive down the hill. I didn't wave my arms or demand answers. Experience had taught me that shouting never changes county records. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and called the only person who would understand why I wasn't angry. My attorney, Claire Bennett, answered on the second ring. "Nathan," she asked, "you found something?" I kept watching guests unload coolers outside cabin 12 while a landscaping crew planted young maple trees beside a brand new parking lot. "I think you should clear your afternoon," I said quietly. "How bad is it?" she asked. I counted the rooftops one more time before answering. 52 cabins. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Finally, she asked, "Are you certain they're on your property?" I looked at the old iron survey marker half buried beside my boots, the same marker my father had shown me when I was 16. It hadn't moved an inch in 50 years. "I'm standing next to the boundary pin right now," I replied. Claire let out a slow breath. "Don't confront anyone. Take photographs. Document everything. Then come straight to my office." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked down once more at the peaceful little resort hidden inside my forest. Somewhere down there, somebody believed they had just built the crown jewel of Blackwood Ridge. They had no idea they had spent millions creating the most expensive mistake their HOA would ever make. Nearly 3 hours later, I parked outside Claire Bennett's office on the county square with a camera full of photographs and a notebook filled with times, locations, and observations. Claire never rushed through evidence. She spread every photograph across the conference table one by one, studying each image with the patience of someone assembling a puzzle instead of preparing for a lawsuit. She paused on the aerial photograph, showing rows of identical cabins tucked beneath mature pine trees. "This is not a temporary campground," she said quietly. "No," I answered. "Those buildings are permanent." She nodded without looking up. "Permanent buildings require permits. Roads require permits. Utility lines require permits. Someone signed a great deal of paperwork before a single shovel touched your timberland." That was exactly what worried me. Projects that large did not appear overnight. They grew one approval at a time. Claire opened her laptop and began searching public filings while I poured 2 cups of coffee from the small pot sitting in the corner of her office. After several minutes, she turned the screen toward me. There it was. Blackwood Ridge HOA had announced the grand opening of Cedar Pines Retreat, describing it as an exclusive mountain getaway reserved for residents and their guests. The article praised the board's vision, highlighted environmentally responsible construction, and quoted HOA President Vanessa Caldwell promising that the cabins would increase property values while creating a stronger sense of community. The photographs showed smiling families cutting a ceremonial ribbon beneath freshly carved wooden signs. Local business owners applauded the project. County tourism officials welcomed another destination for visitors. Even the newspaper called it one of the most ambitious private developments in the region. Nobody questioned where the land actually belonged. Claire leaned back in her chair. "Confidence can be expensive," she said, especially when nobody bothers to ask the right question. I remained silent, studying Vanessa's photograph. She stood in front of the reception lodge wearing a cream-colored blazer, shaking hands with residents while pointing proudly toward the forest behind her. Everything about the event suggested certainty. Investors smiled. Contractors posed for photographs. Board members congratulated one another as if years of planning had finally paid off. Watching those images, I realized something important. They truly believed every document supporting the project was valid. They were celebrating because they thought the hard part was already behind them. Claire closed the article and folded her hands. Nathan, I do not want anyone contacted. No letters. No phone calls. No surprise visits. From this point forward, we let the records speak for themselves. I nodded. My father used to say that timber grows slowly because trees never rush to prove they are stronger than the wind. Paperwork worked much the same way. It did not raise its voice. It simply waited until the right moment. As I gathered my photographs, Claire made one final request. Tomorrow morning, I want certified copies of every survey your family has ever recorded, especially anything older than the subdivision itself. I stopped with my hand on the office door. You think something happened before they started building? Claire looked directly at me before answering. No, I think the real story started decades before anyone ever imagined those cabins would exist. Nearly every courthouse in America has a basement that smells like old paper, dust, and forgotten history. The following morning, I met Claire at the county records office just after 8. The clerk recognized her immediately and disappeared into the archive room without asking many questions. A few minutes later, he returned pushing a metal cart stacked with oversized survey books, handwritten plat maps, deed transfers, and property indexes dating back more than 70 years. Most people would have seen a mountain of paperwork. Claire smiled as though someone had handed her a map to buried treasure. We spent the next several hours comparing modern subdivision plans against the original timber surveys my grandfather commissioned after returning from military service. Every line had to match. Every bearing had to agree. Every monument had to remain exactly where the original surveyors placed it decades earlier. Around lunchtime, an elderly county survey technician named Robert Ellis joined us. He had retired several years earlier but still volunteered twice a week because, as he liked to say, old maps deserved someone who remembered how they were drawn. Robert adjusted his reading glasses and carefully unfolded one of the oldest survey sheets on the table. The paper was yellow around the edges, but the ink remained surprisingly sharp. He traced one boundary with his finger before stopping beside a handwritten notation. This marker should still exist, he said quietly. Nobody ever petitioned to relocate it. Claire looked at me without saying a word. That was the same iron boundary pin I had photographed the day before overlooking the cabins. Robert asked to see my pictures. He enlarged one image until the weathered marker filled the computer screen. After several silent moments, he leaned back in his chair. That is the original monument, he finally said. If that marker has never moved, then neither has the property line. I felt my stomach tighten, not because I was surprised, but because hearing those words from someone who had spent 40 years surveying land carried a different kind of weight. Claire thanked him before asking another question. Could an entire development be designed using an incorrect boundary? Robert gave a slow nod. It happens more often than people think. One mistaken assumption gets copied onto another drawing, then another. Years later, everyone believes the mistake because they have all been looking at the same bad map. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The room became so quiet that I could hear the old wall clock ticking above the filing cabinets. Claire organized every certified copy into neat folders while I kept staring at the faded survey from decades earlier. The cabins were no longer the biggest question in my mind. What troubled me now was how an error that large could survive through architects, engineers, contractors, inspectors, lenders, and an entire homeowners association without anyone stopping long enough to compare the newest plans with the oldest records. Before we left, Robert handed Claire one final document that had not been requested. It was an aerial survey completed almost 30 years before Blackwood Ridge existed. A faint pencil mark circled the exact section of Timberland where the cabins now stood. Claire studied the page for a long moment before carefully sliding it into a separate folder. Nathan, she said as we walked toward the parking lot, I think someone ignored more than a property line. I think someone ignored a warning that was already sitting in the county records long before the first tree was ever cleared. Driving home that afternoon, I kept thinking about something Robert had said. One mistaken assumption gets copied onto another drawing until everyone forgets where the truth began. That is probably the strangest thing about land ownership. The ground never changes its mind. Only people do. Roads get renamed. Neighborhoods appear. Developers replace forests with vacation homes. New maps are printed every few years. But the original survey remains exactly what it was the day someone first walked the property with a compass and measuring chain. My grandfather understood that better than anyone I ever knew. He used to tell me that trees grow slowly because they trust the seasons instead of chasing them. He believed land worked the same way. You did not protect property by arguing louder than your neighbors. You protected it by keeping every deed, every tax receipt, every survey, and every legal record in perfect order. At the time, I thought he was simply an organized old logger. Years later, I realized he had spent his entire life preparing for a disagreement that had never happened during his lifetime. When I arrived at the farmhouse, I walked past the equipment shed and unlocked the small stone building my father always called the archive room. It had once been an old smokehouse before he converted it into secure storage for family records. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Metal filing cabinets sat beneath dusty windows overlooking the Timberland. Every cabinet carried handwritten labels with years instead of subjects. 1968, 1974, 1981. It felt less like opening a storage room and more like stepping into the memory of my entire family. I found the cabinet my father had organized before he passed away. Inside were leather binders filled with carefully protected survey plats, forestry management reports, timber harvest permits, correspondence with county officials, and photographs documenting boundary monuments across the property. Nothing had been thrown away. My father believed records became more valuable with age because memories faded while paper remained patient. I spent the rest of the afternoon comparing those files with the certified copies Claire had collected. Every page confirmed the same boundaries. Every description pointed toward the same monuments. Nothing suggested that our eastern property line had ever changed by a single inch. As evening settled across the forest, golden sunlight filtered through the tall pines outside the archive room. I could hear the distant sound of chainsaws somewhere beyond the ridge where the cabins stood, followed by the faint laughter of vacationers enjoying another peaceful evening. None of them knew they were spending the weekend inside a legal question that stretched back decades. They were simply trusting the people who built the resort. That realization made me feel surprisingly calm instead of angry. The guests were not my problem. Even most of the contractors probably believed they had worked on the correct parcel. The real answer had to be somewhere higher up the chain, somewhere decisions had been made long before the first foundation was poured. As I closed the final binder, one small envelope slipped from between two old survey maps and landed on the wooden floor. Across the front, written in my father's careful handwriting, were only 6 words. Do not ignore the eastern boundary file. Inside the envelope was a folded letter and a single survey sketch drawn by my father nearly 20 years earlier. The paper had softened with age, but every line remained steady. Every note written with the same careful handwriting I remembered watching across the kitchen table when I was a boy. At the top, he had written one sentence. Some boundaries disappear from memory long before they disappear from the law. I sat down beside the old workbench and began reading. The letter explained that a regional developer had approached him years before with plans for a luxury mountain community bordering our timberland. My father welcomed growth as long as people respected property lines. He even allowed survey crews temporary access across one of our old logging roads so they could reach the neighboring parcel more safely. According to his notes, the crews finished their work without incident, thanked him for the cooperation, and left. A few weeks later, however, he noticed fresh wooden stakes standing several hundred feet farther west than the original survey monuments. Instead of assuming someone had made a harmless mistake, he contacted the county survey office. A second inspection confirmed the wooden stakes were inaccurate and instructed the developer to remove them immediately. The matter appeared settled. My father documented everything, stored every letter, and never mentioned it again because the neighboring project stalled during an economic downturn. Reading those pages, I realized something that made the room feel strangely quiet. The incorrect stakes had existed once before. If someone years later relied on an old planning file instead of the corrected county records, the same mistake could easily return without anyone realizing where it had started. I unfolded the sketch attached to the letter. My father had circled the exact ridge where the cabins now stood and marked the original iron monument with a bold red pencil. Beside it, he wrote another note. Never trust temporary markers over permanent monuments. Those words echoed almost perfectly what Robert had explained at the records office. I gathered every document from the envelope and carried them into the farmhouse where I spread them across the dining room table beneath a bright reading lamp. Piece by piece, the timeline began fitting together. The old correction from decades earlier, the unchanged county survey, the surviving iron boundary pin, the modern subdivision, the newly built resort. None of it looked accidental anymore. It looked like one forgotten error quietly passing from one generation of paperwork to the next until millions of dollars depended on it being true. Before the evening ended, I scanned every page and sent digital copies to Claire. She called less than 15 minutes later. I could hear excitement in her normally calm voice. "Nathan," she said, "your father may have preserved the missing link we have been searching for." I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark outline of the Timberland stretching beneath the stars. Somewhere beyond those trees, families were enjoying campfires, unaware that the history of the ground beneath their cabins had been written decades before the first reservation was ever accepted. Claire paused for a moment before speaking again. "Tomorrow I want to compare these papers with the original subdivision application. If my instincts are right, someone submitted plans based on information they never bothered to verify." The next morning, Claire and I requested every document connected to the original subdivision approval, including engineering plans, environmental reports, permit applications, and correspondence between the developer and the county planning office. The clerk wheeled out another stack of binders so large it barely fit across the conference table. Most people would have searched for dramatic evidence first. Claire ignored the glossy site plans and reached directly for the oldest application forms because she believed the first version of any project usually revealed more truth than the polished copies that followed. Hour after hour, we compared signatures, legal descriptions, and survey references. Most of the paperwork matched perfectly until Claire suddenly stopped turning pages. She slid one application across the table without saying a word. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. The legal description listed the subdivision parcel, the project engineer, the reviewing agencies, and the expected construction schedule. Then she pointed toward a single line near the bottom. One survey reference number had been crossed out by hand and replaced with another. There were initials beside the correction, but no explanation anywhere in the file. Claire frowned. That should never happen without supporting documentation. She immediately asked the clerk whether an amendment file existed. After searching the archive for nearly 20 minutes, he returned empty-handed. No amendment. No supplemental survey. No approval explaining why the boundary reference had changed. It was simply different. That alone did not prove anyone acted intentionally, but it created a question that should have been answered years earlier. Claire carefully photographed every page before placing colored tabs throughout the binder. On the drive back toward my Timberland, she remained unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Nathan, mistakes happen. Survey crews make them. Engineers make them. County offices make them. What concerns me is not the mistake itself. It is what happened after someone noticed it." I understood exactly what she meant. If the corrected survey number had been accepted without verification, then every drawing produced afterward could have inherited the same error. Every contractor, lender, architect, and homeowner would have trusted documents that were quietly drifting farther from reality. Late that afternoon, I drove past the entrance to the cabin development again, staying on the public road where anyone had the right to travel. The resort looked busier than ever. Pickup trucks delivered outdoor furniture. Landscapers spread fresh mulch around newly planted trees. Families checked into the reception lodge while children carried fishing rods toward a small pond beside the walking trail. A banner announced that additional cabin reservations were already filling for the upcoming fall season. The project was growing more valuable every day. From a distance, I noticed a woman directing workers near the entrance with a clipboard in one hand and rolled construction drawings under the other arm. Even without meeting her, I recognized Vanessa Caldwell from the newspaper photographs. She greeted contractors with complete confidence, pointing toward future expansion areas beyond the finished cabins. Nobody around her appeared worried. Nobody questioned whether the ground beneath their feet actually belonged to the association. I remained inside my truck for only a few minutes before quietly driving away. There was still no reason to interrupt their work because every new improvement they completed created another permanent record, another invoice, another permit, another piece of evidence tied to the same disputed boundary. As the resort disappeared behind the tall pines in my rearview mirror, I realized Claire had been right from the beginning. We were no longer trying to discover whether something was wrong. We were beginning to understand how long everyone had been building their confidence on a single unchecked assumption. Nearly 2 weeks passed without a single letter being mailed or a single complaint being filed. From the outside, it probably looked as though nothing was happening at all. That was exactly what Claire wanted. Every morning, the resort became a little busier. More vehicles filled the parking areas. New directional signs appeared along the entrance road. Contractors finished a covered picnic pavilion beside the central meadow while another crew poured concrete for a maintenance building behind the reception lodge. Every improvement quietly increased the project's value, and every invoice created another official record connecting the construction to the same disputed parcel. One afternoon, Claire asked me to meet her with a licensed independent surveyor named Daniel Brooks. Unlike the original engineering firms, Daniel had never worked for the subdivision or the county. His only job was to determine where the property line actually existed using the original legal descriptions and surviving monuments. We spent the better part of an entire day hiking through dense timber with measuring equipment, old plats, satellite maps, and metal detectors searching for every permanent survey marker referenced in my family's records. One after another, the monuments appeared exactly where the original surveys said they should be. Some were hidden beneath moss. Others had nearly disappeared under decades of fallen leaves. But every one of them remained undisturbed. Daniel carefully documented each location, photographed every marker, and compared his measurements against the legal descriptions. As the afternoon sun filtered through the pines, he lowered his equipment and quietly shook his head. "Nathan," he said, "these monuments agree with one another almost perfectly. They establish a continuous boundary that has not changed." Claire asked the question neither of us had wanted to ask aloud. "Where does that place the cabins?" Daniel unfolded his field map, drew one final line across the page, and looked directly at us. "Every cabin, the reception lodge, the maintenance building, most of the walking trails, they all fall inside your recorded property." Nobody celebrated. We simply stood there listening to the wind moving through the trees. After a long silence, Daniel continued, "This is one of the cleanest boundary confirmations I have seen in years. There is nothing ambiguous about these monuments." On the drive back toward town, Claire organized the photographs and survey data into chronological order. She explained that independent verification mattered because judges trusted evidence that could withstand careful examination from every side. Personal opinions accomplished very little. Consistent documentation accomplished everything. Late that evening, I drove past the development once more from the public road. Strings of warm lights glowed between the cabins while families gathered around outdoor fire pits, enjoying another peaceful night in the mountains. Near the entrance, I noticed construction fencing surrounding a freshly cleared section of timber where heavy equipment sat parked for the weekend. A large sign displayed an artist's rendering of the next expansion phase with additional cabins, a small event hall, and new parking areas scheduled to begin soon. I looked at the illustration for several moments before quietly driving away. They were no longer protecting what they had already built. They were preparing to build even more, completely unaware that every new foundation would only deepen the legal problem already waiting beneath the forest floor. By the beginning of October, the mountain retreat had become one of the busiest destinations in the county. Every weekend, every cabin appeared occupied. The reception parking lot filled before noon, and local restaurants proudly welcomed the extra business. Newspaper articles praised the Homeowners Association for creating an economic success story, while travel bloggers posted photographs of quiet forest trails and cozy stone fireplaces. From the outside, it looked like the project could not have been more successful. That was exactly why Claire advised me to remain patient for just a little longer. "A court cannot ignore clear evidence," she reminded me. "But timing matters. We want the complete record before we ask a judge to examine it. During those weeks, our office quietly assembled everything into a single organized case. Certified deeds, original surveys, independent field measurements, historical aerial photographs, county records, my father's correspondence, Robert Ellis's verification of the permanent monuments, Daniel Brooks's modern survey report. Every document reinforced the same conclusion without contradicting another. Nothing depended on opinions. Everything depended on records that had existed long before the first cabin foundation had been poured. One afternoon, Claire called with news that finally changed the direction of the case. She had completed a comparison between the original subdivision filing and every subsequent amendment submitted over the years. The legal descriptions remained remarkably consistent except for one boundary reference that had quietly migrated from the original survey to later engineering drawings. No supporting approval existed anywhere in the county archive explaining why that change had ever been accepted. That missing explanation matters, Claire said. Someone relied on a revision that was never properly documented. A few days later, she filed a formal action requesting judicial review of the disputed property boundary together with an emergency request preventing any additional construction until ownership could be determined. We did not ask for headlines. We did not ask for damages. We asked only for the court to determine what the recorded property lines already showed. While the paperwork moved through the legal system, life at the resort continued as though nothing had changed. Construction crews unloaded framing materials near the proposed expansion site. Survey flags appeared beyond the existing cabins. A temporary sign announced that reservations for the next phase would open soon because demand had exceeded every expectation. Vanessa Caldwell gave another interview celebrating what she called the future of mountain living, confidently describing additional cabins, outdoor gathering spaces, and expanded recreational facilities. Watching that interview, I realized she truly believed the project had reached its brightest moment. She smiled with the certainty of someone convinced every difficult decision was already behind her. Claire watched the interview beside me before quietly closing her laptop. Confidence built on incomplete information usually lasts right up until the paperwork arrives, she said. Less than 48 hours later, the courthouse notified every involved party that the judge had agreed to review the evidence on an expedited schedule because the dispute involved active construction and potential questions of legal ownership. That single notice did not end the case, but it changed everything. For the first time since I had spotted smoke rising through my Timberland, the question was no longer whether anyone would examine the records. The question had become what everyone would do once those records were placed in front of a judge. The hearing began on a crisp Thursday morning with far less drama than most people would expect. There were no raised voices, no emotional speeches, and no surprises waiting in the hallway. Just folders, survey maps, certified records, and people quietly taking their seats inside a county courtroom. Vanessa Caldwell arrived with several board members, legal counsel, and thick binders that appeared every bit as organized as ours. She greeted familiar faces with the confidence of someone expecting another routine legal matter to end in her favor. Claire simply nodded politely before placing our evidence on the counsel table in the exact order we had assembled it over the previous weeks. The judge opened the proceeding by explaining that the issue before the court was straightforward. The question was not whether the cabins were well built or whether the association had acted in good faith. The only question was who legally owned the land beneath them. Claire presented the original deeds first, followed by the certified county surveys, the historic aerial photographs, my father's documented correspondence, the independent survey completed by Daniel Brooks, and the testimony confirming that every permanent monument remained in its original location. Each exhibit pointed toward the same conclusion without conflicting with any other record. Then came the subdivision filings. Claire carefully guided the court through the original application, the unexplained survey reference change, and the absence of any approved amendment supporting that alteration. When the judge asked whether the county possessed documentation authorizing the revised boundary description, the clerk answered with a single sentence. No such record exists. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Vanessa's legal team argued that years of construction, permitting, financing, and public reliance demonstrated that everyone believed the boundaries were correct. The judge listened carefully before responding that belief could never replace recorded ownership. Property rights were determined by lawful records, not by assumptions repeated often enough to sound true. Daniel Brooks then explained how every surviving monument aligned perfectly with the original legal descriptions, leaving no uncertainty regarding the actual boundary. Even Robert Ellis confirmed that the permanent markers had remained unchanged for decades. After reviewing every exhibit, the judge recessed briefly before returning with the written ruling. He stated that the evidence consistently established ownership of the disputed parcel in my family's name and that the structures occupying that land had been constructed on property not owned by the homeowners association. Because ownership had never lawfully transferred, continued occupancy could not remain in place while the legal issues were resolved. The court ordered the cabins vacated within the timetable established in the written order, prohibited additional construction on the disputed parcel, and directed the parties to begin the legal process required to address the improvements already standing on the property. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The ruling simply settled a question the records had answered long before anyone poured the first foundation. As people quietly gathered their papers, Vanessa remained seated for several moments, staring at the same survey maps she had probably never imagined would matter so much. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt cool and remarkably still. Claire closed the final case binder and looked toward the distant timbered hills. "Your grandfather protected those boundaries," she said softly. "Your father preserved the evidence. All we did was place the truth in front of the court." I looked back toward the mountains where 52 quiet cabins still stood beneath the tall pines, knowing that the land had never changed its story. It had simply waited for someone willing to read it correctly.